Okay, so I was 100% certain that I had a good Halloween shirt, but apparently I can't find it anymore. So anyway, I'm wearing one of Meredith's shirts today. I actually grew up in the Lutheran church, and growing up as a Lutheran, you learn a lot about the life of Martin Luther, the individual who kind of kicked off the entire theological code that being a Lutheran is based on. Well, one of the things I've always found interesting about Martin Luther is his obsession with sin and guilt. Now, you might hear that and think, well, okay, Pastor Joseph, aren't a lot of pastors and religious people obsessed with sin and guilt? And I mean, maybe to an extent, but Martin Luther really took it to another level. There's actually stories of him going to confession, leaving, walking down the hall, and then going right back to confession because he felt like he couldn't shed the guilt off of his soul. He was very obsessed with this, and there's actually this interesting interaction that occurs to him when he goes to give his first mass. So imagine the scene. Martin Luther, he's gone through religious life, he's been a monk for a while, he's finally gone through and gotten ordained as a priest, and he is now going to give his first mass service. So everyone's looking at him, and he's getting ready to go up and actually, perform the sacraments of communion. And this is what happens. He actually ends up uttering this phrase: "We offer unto thee the living, the true, the eternal God." And he stopped. This is what Martin Luther would write later on about that moment in which he stopped. He writes this: "At these words, I was utterly stupefied and terror-stricken. I thought to myself, with what tongue shall I address such majesty, seeing that all men ought to tremble in the presence of even an earthly prince? Who am I that I should lift up mine eyes or raise my hands to the divine majesty? The angels surround him. At his nod, the earth trembles. And shall a miserable little pygmy say, I want this, I ask for that, for I am dust and ashes and full of sin. I am speaking to the living, eternal, the true God." You can just see in how Martin Luther approached the concept of sin that he felt so insufficient. He felt so incapable of absolving himself from all of the things that sought to tear him down. I think many of us at different points in our life feel a lot like Martin Luther. We feel like we're just being torn down by this feeling of guilt that we just can't shake. Sometimes that guilt might actually lead us down a direction that helps us to get closer to God. I mean, it might really just be a form of our own consciousness kind of holding us accountable for our actions, saying, hey, look, you have this tendency to want this or to do that. Maybe don't do that. That's not a great thing to do. And if that's the case, then these individual emotions of guilt may not necessarily be terrible. But what about that feeling of guilt that just seats down in your soul? It just takes root and you can't get it out. No matter what you try to do or the things you try to preoccupy your mind with, it just sits there and it festers. This form of guilt can be caused by the outside world, or it could be caused by us judging ourselves. But regardless of what causes it, the one thing that is consistent is that it can lead us into a direction where we start actually fearing the God that we should be finding salvation in. When I think about the subject of guilt, specifically guilt that's imposed by other people upon us, I can't help but think about this story from John. It's Jesus and a woman who is accused of being an adulterer. Now, you're going to read through the entire story yourselves here in just a moment, but what I want you to pay special attention to is how Christ ends up interacting with the woman after he's effectively disarmed the entire crowd. This is actually what's going to take place. As you see, the entire crowd feels like they have their standard of morality or their standard of what's right and wrong, and they're trying to impose that, in a very judicial way against this woman accused of being an adulteress. But yet Christ comes in and completely flips the script. It's not so much that he just shuts them up or that he saves the life of a woman, as much as it is that he establishes his authority as the only one who is uniquely qualified to be able to judge the guilt or the innocence of an individual person. And so consider this. If Christ is the only one qualified to judge the guilt or the innocence of any one of us, and he looks at us and says, I don't find any guilt in you, then who should we fear? This concept of Christ being the sole authority when it comes to guilt or innocence is something that, yes, applies to the rest of the world trying to look at us and say that we're guilty, but it just as well applies to us looking in at ourselves. Oftentimes you may have heard this phrase, that we are our own worst critic, and it really is true. I mean, we know the most about ourselves of anybody, and that includes all of our flaws. So we tend to be very, very hard on ourselves. If you don't believe that, just sit here and record your voice or take a video of yourself and then go back and listen to your own voice or listen to yourself sing. Almost everybody universally will say they can't stand listening to themselves talk or watching themselves perform on a stage or anything like that. We are truly our own worst critics. But yet, when we start looking at the subject of guilt, we have to stop and recognize the fact that there is one who is a bigger authority in our flaws than ourselves, and that is God. He created us. He knows the things that we excel at. He knows the things that we struggle with. He knows the things that we've been able to overcome, and he knows the things that still eat away at us. No matter how dark and secret of a place we try to keep some of our hangups and some of our guilts and some of our shame, Christ already knows those things are there. And yet, just like the woman accused of adultery, he also looks at us and says, neither do I condemn you. What a beautiful thought that Christ looks at us. He doesn't just look at us in general. He doesn't just look at us as a people, and he doesn't just look at us as kind of like this card-carrying member of his church. He looks at what we have done, and he looks at what we think, and he looks at every piece of our mind and our hearts that maybe we're not proud of, and yet he looks at us and says, neither do I condemn you. That's such a freeing thought. But yet so many of us are very hung up on this idea that I just can't let go of being my own judge. There's something about this guilt that I have to carry on myself because I feel like I haven't paid atonement enough. I feel like it's just not fair that I should be allowed to continue moving on or having a new life or being able to move forward away from some mistake that I maybe have made in the past. And you're right, it's not fair. But the fact that it's not fair by our standards shows exactly how glorious and perfect the grace of Jesus Christ truly is. Second Corinthians 12:9 has this phrase in it, but my grace is sufficient for you. That's what it all comes down to. When we think about our guilt and the things that the world wants to heap on us, tell us that you're not allowed to walk away from whatever you did in the past. You're forever branded with that scarlet letter of whatever sin you committed or that poor judgment that you had or that thing you said or that relationship you spoiled. Christ looks at that and says, my grace is sufficient. When we have those things in our lives that we can't forgive ourselves for, those things that we feel like we're at fault, that if it hadn't have been for this thing that I did or this error that I made, maybe everything would be all right. Christ once again looks at us and says, my grace is sufficient. The reason why what Jesus Christ did on the cross is so amazing is not just because it was a symbol. It's not just because it was a miracle. It's because he was doing something that is so unbelievably unfathomable to our own minds that we can't help but stand in awe at the glory of God. And that is to look at every ounce of our guilt and to say, you are totally forgiven. That is the glory of Jesus Christ. That is the reason why we can go through this life no matter what the world is throwing at us and no matter what we try to throw at ourselves, and we can walk through it with a smile, having this inner peace and this inner joy. It's because Christ is sufficient. It's because of exactly what we've been talking about over the last several weeks, that he's enough. And it really is that simple. It might be hard and it might be difficult to actually keep in mind when we have all the distractions around us, but it is very simple. He's enough. So whatever it is that you're holding on to, let go of it, because His grace was sufficient for you. Christ looks at you and says, "Where are your accusers? Neither do I condemn you." That's our story that we had for today. I hope you were able to get something out of it. Until we meet next time, God bless.